Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a trip back in time. A really weird trip. We're heading to 9th century Rome, a place teetering on the edge of chaos and absurdity. And I'll be honest, if you were actually dropped there, your chances of making it through the first week would be, let's just say, slim. It's a story so bizarre it sounds like a fever dream cooked up by a very stressed medieval monk. It involves a pope, another pope who is very, very dead, and a courtroom drama for the ages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing on one of the 7 hills of Rome. It's the year of our Lord, 891. The sun is setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the city. From up here, you can almost pretend it's the grand Rome of the history books. You see the hulking silhouette of the Colosseum, the sprawling ruins of the Forum, the majestic Pantheon still standing proud. But as you look closer, the illusion shatters. This isn't the Rome of Augustus or Trajan. This is a fractured, messy, and frankly, quite dirty city. The grand monuments of the past are now just quarries for building materials, or makeshift fortresses for feuding families. You see smoke rising not from grand villas, but from crude shacks built into the arches of ancient aqueducts. The population has dwindled from over 1 million in its heyday to maybe 30,000 souls, huddled together in a small section of the old city near the Tiber River. It's a city haunted by the ghosts of its own greatness. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp stone, and something vaguely unpleasant you try not to identify. The sounds are a cacophony of life, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of cartwheels on uneven stone, the constant, melodic chime of 100 church bells, and underneath it all, a low hum of anxious chatter from the streets below. This city is holding its breath. Why? Because Rome in the late 9th century is the epicenter of a brutal tug of war. This is the main political tension of the era. Imagine 2 giant magnets pulling on the city. From the north, you have the Holy Roman Emperor, a powerful Frankish or German king who believes he has the divine right to control Italy and, by extension, the Pope. From within Italy, you have powerful, ambitious local nobles, like the ruthless dukes of Spoleto, who see the emperor as a foreign invader and the papacy as their personal prize. And who's caught in the middle of this giant geopolitical arm wrestle? The Pope. Being Pope sounds great, right? Big hat, cool palace. Except in 9th century Rome, the job comes with a shockingly poor life expectancy. The papacy has become a political football, and whoever holds it has to pick a side. Do you align with the distant but powerful emperor, or the nearby and very dangerous Italian dukes? Choose Rome, and you might find yourself blinded, imprisoned, or mysteriously falling from a castle wall. But the threats aren't just external. The real danger is often right here, inside the city walls. Roman politics is a viper's nest of feuding aristocratic families. The Corsi, the Torsulani, the Crescentii. These families control different parts of the city, command their own private militias, and are constantly scheming to place their guy on the papal throne. The city isn't one Rome, it's a dozen little Romes, all suspicious of each other. And here's a little detail people often miss: the Roman people themselves. The demos are a political force. They aren't just a passive crowd. They can be whipped into a frenzy by a charismatic leader or a well-placed rumor. They are a fickle, powerful mob that can storm a palace and drag a pope from his throne, or hail a new one as a hero. Controlling the mob is key to controlling Rome. This whole chaotic period is what some historians later dubbed the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. It's an age of intense corruption and violence within the church. And this brings us to a point historians still argue about. Some chronicles from the time paint this as a pornocracy, or the rule of harlots, claiming that a couple of powerful aristocratic women, Theodora and Herd also Maroziae, controlled the papacy through their lovers and son. Other historians argue this is likely an exaggeration, a smear campaign written by their political enemies in Germany to discredit the Roman-controlled papacy. The truth, as is so often the case, is probably somewhere messier and more complicated in the middle. What is certain is that the city is a powder keg. Every church sermon, every public procession, every back alley deal is layered with political meaning. It's in this simmering pot of paranoia and ambition that our story truly begins. Because to climb the ladder in a city like this, you can't just be a man of God. You have to be a politician, a survivor, and maybe just a little bit of a monster. And a man named Formosus was about to prove he was very, very good at being all three. So, let's zoom in on this man Formosus. Try to picture him. History doesn't leave us a clear portrait, but we can piece together an impression. His name, Formosus, literally means handsome or beautifully formed in Latin. No pressure, dude. Whether he lived up to the name is anyone's guess. But what we do know is that he was charismatic, intelligent, and dangerously ambitious. He wasn't born into one of the great Roman families, which meant he had to be twice as clever and work 3 times as hard to get noticed. By the time our story begins, HES already a big deal. He is the Cardinal Bishop of Porto. Now, this isn't just some sleepy seaside town. Porto was the main port of Rome. Imagine it a bustling, strategic harbour just a stone's throw from the city. Everything and everyone coming to Rome by sea, pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, messengers had to pass through Porto. As its bishop, you control one of the key gateways to the city. You're the first person important visitors meet. You get the latest news before anyone in Rome, and you collect a hefty amount of taxes and duties. It's a position of immense influence, and Formosus used it masterfully. He wasn't just a local power player, though. He was the papacy's star diplomat. This is the key historical point about him, his mission to Bulgaria. In the 862, the ruler of Bulgaria, Count Boris I, decided he wanted his people to become Christian. This was a huge deal. It was like a massive new market opening up, and two major corporations were competing for the contract: the papacy in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople. Both sent missionaries. Rome sent Formosus, and Formosus absolutely crushed it. He was so persuasive, so charming, so effective that Count Boris and the entire Bulgarian court were enchanted. They didn't just want to join the Roman Church, they specifically requested that Formosus be appointed their archbishop, the head of the entire Bulgarian church. This should have been a massive victory for Rome. But back in the later Anne Palace, Pope Nicholas I got nervous. And here we hit a bit of a weird, almost bureaucratic snag of the medieval world canon law. One of the long-standing rules was that a bishop was married to his diocese. He couldn't just leave Porto to become the Archbishop of Bulgaria, any more than a man could leave his wife to marry another. It was seen as a sign of worldly ambition, of seeking power for its own sake rather than shepherding a flock. So, Pope Nicholas refused the Bulgarian request. Formosus returned to Rome a hero but a frustrated one. He had tasted real power and had it snatched away. When Nicholas died and was succeeded by John VII, things got much, much worse. Pope John saw Formosus not as an asset, but as a threat. He was too popular, too ambitious, and he was cozy with the German emperors, Pope John's political rivals. So John VII decided to cut him down to size. In 876, he convened a synod, a meeting of bishops, and accused Formosus of all sorts of things. The main charge that he had actively conspired to become Archbishop of Bulgaria, thus breaking his vows to the Diocese of Porto, and that he was plotting to usurp the papacy itself. Formosus, seeing which way the wind was blowing, fled Rome. In his absence, he was excommunicated. And here's a little detail that becomes horribly important later. Formosus was eventually forced to appear before the Pope and swear a sacred oath. Picture the scene: Formosus on his knees in a cold stone chapel, one hand on a heavy, gilded copy of the Gospels. He is made to swear that he will never again set foot in Rome and will never again seek to perform any priestly duties. In an age of deep faith, breaking such an oath was not just illegal, it was considered perjury against God himself, a one-way ticket to damnation. Now, historians still argue about Pope John VII's true motives. Was he a principled defender of canon law, genuinely concerned about an overly ambitious bishop, or was this just a raw political power play, a paranoid pope using the law as a weapon to neutralize a popular rival? The records are biased, written by the victors as they always are. But the outcome was clear. Formosus, the handsome, charismatic star of the church, was now an outcast. But in 9th century Rome, your fortunes can turn on a dime. Pope John VII's reign ended, as many did, in violence. He was reputedly bludgeoned to death by his own relatives, who then poisoned him just to be sure. His successor, Pope Marinus I, happened to be a good friend of Formosus. One of his very first acts was to completely nullify the excommunication and welcome Formosus back to his position as Cardinal Bishop of Porto. The sacred oath was forgotten, explained away as having been sworn under duress. Just like that, Formosus was back in the game. He had been to the political wilderness and returned. He now knew with absolute certainty how brutal the game could be. But the pardon didn't erase the past. The political faction that had supported the now dead Pope John VII, a powerful Roman family allied with the Dukes of Spoleto, watched Formosus's return with cold fury. They hadn't forgotten. They saw him not as a forgiven colleague, but as their mortal enemy who had just cheated political death. And in the shadows, another man, a supporter of that very faction, a man named Stephen, was watching and waiting. Now let's turn our gaze to the other side of the chessboard. Into the shadows steps a man named Stephen. We don't know as much about his early life as we do about Formosus's, which is often the case with those who lurk in the background before seizing power. He was Roman born and bred, which gave him a home field advantage. And most importantly, he belonged to the other team. If 9th century Roman politics was a bitter sports rivalry, Formosus was the star quarterback for the pro-Germanic faction. They believed that the best way for Rome to be safe and for the papacy to be strong was to have a powerful, but distant, Holy Roman Emperor as their protector. This emperor, usually a Frank or a German, would keep the local Italian warlords in check and provide military muscle when needed. They were the internationalist party, if you will. Stephen, on the other hand, was a key player for the pro-Italian or SPO Latin faction. This group was fiercely nationalistic and deeply suspicious of the northern barbarians. Their champions were the Dukes of Spoleto, a powerful and ruthless Italian family who controlled a large chunk of central Italy just south of Rome. They saw the German emperors as foreign invaders and believed that the Pope should be a purely Italian affair, preferably controlled by, you guessed it, them. They were the local ISD party. You can already see the inevitable collision course. These weren't just friendly disagreements debated over wine. These were blood feuds. Careers, properties, and lives were on the line. Stephen's early career was shaped by this fierce loyalty. Here's a key piece of information that gets a bit tangled in the historical record but is crucial to understanding his later actions. Stephen was likely consecrated as a bishop by Formosus himself. Think about that for a second. At some point, probably during one of those brief periods of political calm or when Formosus was at the peak of his power before his first exile, Stephen, a young and ambitious cleric from the rival camp, knelt before Formosus to be made bishop. Formosus would have laid his hands upon Stephen's head and uttered the sacred prayers, making him a successor to the apostles. This fact is something historians still debate the timing and context of, but its implications are profound. In the rigid hierarchy of the church, this made Formosus Stephen's spiritual father. For Stephen to later turn on Formosus wasn't just a political betrayal in the mindset of the time, it was a profound violation of a sacred, almost familial bond. It adds a layer of intense psychological drama to the whole affair. Was Stephen a reluctant participant in the ceremony, forced by political necessity to accept consecration from a man he despised, or was he a true opportunist, happy to take a promotion from anyone, only to discard that loyalty when it was no longer useful? We'll never know for sure, but it adds a chilling dimension to his character. As a bishop, Stephen likely served in the city of Agni, a stronghold of the SPO Latin faction. While Formosus was traveling to Bulgaria and hobnobbing with emperors, Stephen was cementing his power base at Rome, making connections with the local Roman aristocracy and the powerful SPO Latin dukes. He was there in the city when Pope John VII, his faction's ally, turned on Formosus, excommunicated him, and forced him to swear that oath. Stephen would have seen this as justice. He would have watched with satisfaction as the high-flying, pro-German diplomat was brought crashing down to earth. And you can imagine his fury and disgust when Pope Marinus I, the successor, simply wiped the slate clean. In Stephen's eyes, this wasn't forgiveness, it was a gross injustice. Formosus was a perjurer, a man who had broken a sacred vow sworn on the Gospels. To just let him back and to restore him to his powerful position at Porto, it was a mockery of canon law and an insult to God. More than that, it was a huge political loss for his side. Their enemy was back, more powerful than ever. This is where the seed of a very specific, very personal hatred begins to grow. It's not just about politics anymore. For Stephen, Formosus becomes the embodiment of everything that is wrong with the church: ambition that overrides sacred law, political maneuvering that desecrates holy oaths, and a flagrant disregard for the proper order of things which, of course, meant the order that benefited the SBO-Latin faction. Here's a small telling detail about the era: communication was slow and unreliable. News traveled at the speed of a horse. Rumors, however, traveled much faster. In the claustrophobic world of Roman church politics, gossip and slander were both weapons. You can just imagine Stephen and his allies, gathered in a dimly lit room in a Roman villa, voices low, trading stories about Formosus's supposed arrogance, his foreign friends, his unholy ambition. These stories would harden into an unshakable, distorted truth in their minds. Formosus wasn't just a political opponent, he was a monstrous figure, a cancer in the heart of the church that needed to be cut out. So while Formosus is once again rising, basking in the glow of his restoration, Stephen is in the shadows. He is watching. He is nurturing a grudge that is slowly metastasizing into a truly pathological obsession. He represents the coiled snake in the Roman grass, a reminder that in this city, forgiveness is a sign of weakness, and political memory is very, very long. Now, let's pull the camera back a bit. To understand the sheer desperation and madness that's about to unfold, you need to grasp just how unstable the top job in Rome really was. We call it the papacy, a title that evokes images of stability, tradition, and timeless authority. But in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, Pope was one of the most dangerous job titles in the world. The papal throne wasn't so much a divinely ordained seat of power as it was a political hot potato tossed around in a game of deadly musical chairs. Consider the 5 years leading up to our main event. Between 891 and 896, Rome saw no fewer than 5 popes. 5. That's an average of 1 pope per year. Some reigns were so short they were measured in weeks. It's a turnover rate that would make a modern tech startup look stable. And these weren't peaceful retirements. Let's do a quick, grim roll call. First, you have Pope Stephen V, who managed to die of natural causes, which by the standards of the day was a major achievement. He was succeeded in 891 by our man Formosus. As we've seen, Formosus was the candidate of the pro-Germanic faction. He managed to hold on for about 4.5 years, a veritable eternity in this era, before he died in 896. His death created an immediate power vacuum, and the chaos began instantly. The Roman populace, likely whipped up by the rival SBO-Latin faction, elected a man named Boniface VI. Here's a wild little fact about Boniface. He had previously been defrosted twice for immorality and misconduct. He was about as qualified to be pope as a wolf is to be a shepherd. His reign lasted for a grand total of 15 days before he died, most likely from gout, though poison was a popular theory. Some historians even debate whether he should be considered a legitimate pope at all, or just an antipope who held the chair for a couple of weeks. After the brief and not so lamented reign of Boniface VI, the SBO-Latin finally on the throne our other main character, Stephen VI. The guy who has been nursing that epic grudge against Formosus. He is now Pope Stephen VI, and he has the power to settle old scores. This rapid-fire succession of popes tells you everything you need to know about the institution's weakness. The process of electing a pope was a complete mess. Today you have the College of Cardinals, the conclave, the secret ballots, the white smoke. It's a highly structured process. Back then, not so much. In theory, the Pope was supposed to be elected by the clergy and people of Rome. This meant whoever could assemble the biggest mob or the most soldiers on the day of the election usually won. A papal election was a street fight. The powerful aristocratic families would rally their private militias. The rival factions would bribe, threaten, and cajole the clergy. They'd hand out food and wine to the Roman mob to get them on their side, chanting their candidate's name. It was loud, chaotic, and often violent. The Lateran and Palace, the Pope's official residence, was frequently stormed and looted during the transition of power. Here's a bizarre detail of the era: the tradition of the sediust air or aria, or the dung chair. It was a type of porphyry marble toilet-like throne that a new pope was supposed to sit on as part of his consecration. One of its purposes was for an official to physically check that the new pope was in fact a man. This might sound utterly insane, but it was likely a reaction to the persistent medieval legend of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man and was elected pope. While historians are almost universally certain Pope Joan never existed and was a later invention, the existence of the sedius terc or aurea ceremony shows how deeply paranoid and the whole process of succession was. They literally had to check. The papacy was also flat broke. The vast papal states, the lands across central Italy that the Pope was supposed to rule, were mostly out of his control, seized by local lords as Saracen raiders. The Pope in Rome had the title of a grand ruler but often lacked the funds to even repair the city's crumbling basilicas or pay his own soldiers. This financial desperation made the Pope even more dependent on his political patrons. If the Duke of Spoleto or the Holy Roman Emperor was bankrolling your papacy, you were going to do what they said. So when Stephen VI finally sits on that throne in 896, he isn't just a man of God. He is a man who has won a vicious gang war. He is indebted to the powerful Latin family who got him there. He is surrounded by enemies. He is paranoid. And he is sitting in a palace that just a few weeks prior belonged to a man elected by the mob, who succeeded the man's, even despised more than anyone on earth. The air in the Lateran palace is thick with the ghosts of failed popes and the stench of political betrayal. It's not a place for forgiveness or gentle contemplation. It's a place for vengeance. The papal crown isn't a symbol of holiness, it's a heavyweight title belt, and you have to prove you're tough enough to hold onto it. So in the spring of 896, Pope Formosus dies. He was probably in his early 82nd, an ancient age for the 9th century, and he seems to have died of a stroke. As far as papal exits go, it was peaceful. One moment, he was the most powerful man in Christendom, the vicar of Christ on earth the next. He was just an old man whose body had finally given out. His death, however, was anything but peaceful for the city of Rome. The moment the news spread, the fragile political balance he had maintained for 4.5 years shattered like glass. Imagine the scene: church bells tone somber, slow rhythm across the city, announcing the Pope's passing. But in the torchlit halls of the Roman nobility and the shadowy backrooms of the clergy, there is no mourning. There are hurried, whispered conversations. Messengers are dispatched on horseback, riding frantically through the night to carry the news to the Duke of Spoleto and his allies. The game is afoot. Formosus left behind a deeply divided legacy. To his supporters, the pro-Germanic faction, he was a hero. He had restored the prestige of the papacy, stood up to the local bullies, and crowned a legitimate Holy Roman Emperor, enough of Corinthia. They saw his reign as a brief golden age of stability and righteous authority. His death was a catastrophe for them. To his enemies, the Latin faction, his death was a long-awaited opportunity. They saw him as a traitor and a usurper. He had defied his oath, they whispered. He had invited foreign armies into Italy. His entire papacy was, in their eyes, illegitimate. They believed he had illegally moved from his see of Porto to become Bishop of Rome, violating that sacred marriage rule of canon law. This legalistic argument was their primary weapon. It wasn't just that they disliked his politics, they claimed his entire reign, and therefore all of his acts as pope, were null and void. This is the central historical point that fuels the coming madness. If Formosus's papacy was illegitimate, then every priest he ordained, every bishop he consecrated, Every charter he signed, and every decree he issued was also illegitimate. This would cause an administrative earthquake, throwing the entire church in central Italy into chaos. It was the perfect excuse for his enemies to not just seize power in a hostile takeover. And they did. The Espartans and their Roman allies moved fast. They ignored Formicus's chosen successor and, as we saw, muscled their man Boniface VI onto the throne for that brief to reign. When Boniface conveniently dropped dead, their real candidate, Stephen VI, was ready. The election was a sham, a brute force installation of the SPO-Latin candidate. Now, with Stephen VI in power, the SPO-Latin faction had a crucial problem. Formicus might be dead, but his ghost still loomed over the city. His faction, though temporarily defeated, was still powerful. Many of the cardinals and bishops currently serving in Rome had been appointed by Formicus. The man Stephen VI had just crowned as the new Holy Roman Emperor, Lambert of Spoleto, needed his imperial title to be seen as legitimate, but the previous, rival emperor, Arnulf, had been crowned by Formicus. It was all a tangled, contradictory mess. Simply taking over wasn't enough. Stephen VI and his patrons needed to do more than just win the political battle. They needed to win the historical and theological one. They had to utterly destroy Formicus's reputation and legacy, to salt the earth so that his faction could never rise again. They needed to prove, once and for all, that his papacy was invalid. And here's a weird little quirk of the time. In the medieval legal mind, a person's death didn't necessarily end their legal accountability. The concept of posthumous trials existed, though it was incredibly rare. It was sometimes used to seize the property of a deceased person, who was later declared a heretic. The idea was that their crimes had tainted their soul, and their earthly possessions should be forfeit. But it had never, ever been used on a pope. The plan began to form in the paranoid mind of Pope Stephen VI, likely in close consultation with his patrons, the Duke of Spoleto and his fiercely ambitious mother, A.J.L.T. Rude. She, in particular, is often seen by historians as one of the key instigators of the trial. She had a personal vendetta against Formicus, who had crowned a rival emperor. Why not put Formicus himself on trial? Why not have him answer for his crimes in person? The idea was strategically brilliant in its sheer, ghoulish audacity. A public trial would be a spectacle. It would allow Stephen VI to publicly lay out the case against Formicus, the broken oath, the illegal transfer of bishoprics, the crowning of a foreign emperor. He could control the narrative completely. And by forcing all the Formosan appointed to attend, he could make them complicit in their own master's condemnation. It was a loyalty test of the most grotesque kind. Historians are still divided on the primary motivation. Was it pure political vengeance, a show trial designed to legitimize the SPO, Latin power grab, or was Stephen VI a genuine, fanatical zealot, a man so obsessed with the minutiae of canon law and so consumed by his personal hatred that he actually believed a trial of a corpse was a righteous and necessary act to purify the church? Or was it, as is most likely, a toxic cocktail of both a perfect storm of cold political calculation and white-hot personal obsession? The decision was made. The dead would be judged. With Stephen VI now firmly planted on the papal throne, the atmosphere in the later and Palace Coeur de Les. The victory celebrations of the SPO-Latin faction are short-lived, replaced by a tense, simmering need for something more. Winning wasn't enough. The enemy had to be annihilated, not just politically, but retroactively, spiritually. The revenge that had been fermenting for years in Stephen's heart was about to be served, and it was going to be served, and it was going to be served ice cold. You have to understand the psychology at play. Stephen VI is a man who has lived his entire political life in the shadow of Formicus. When Formicus was the star diplomat, Stephen was a minor bishop. When Formicus was pope, Stephen was part of the opposition, biting his tongue and waiting. His entire identity was forged in opposition to this one man. Now, he is the one holding the keys to Street Peter, but the ghost of his predecessor is everywhere. He walks through halls where Formicus gave audiences. He sits on a throne Formicus occupied. He prays in chapels where Formosus led mass. For a man with a festering obsession, this would have been maddening. The engine of this revenge plot isn't just Stephen, though. Standing right behind him, whispering in his ear, is the formidable figure of Agelt Rude, the Duchess of Spoleto. She was the mother of Lambert, the young man Stephen had just crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Agelt Rude was a major political player in her own right, intelligent, ruthless, and fiercely protective of her son's claim to power. Her son Lambert's imperial coronation was tainted because the previous pope, Formosus, had already crowned a different emperor, Arnulf of Carinthia. For Lambert's title to be truly secure, Arnulf's coronation had to be declared invalid, and for that to happen, the man who performed the coronation, Formosus, had to be declared a false pope. Agelt Rude needed Formosus's entire reign to be erased from the history books, so she and Stephen had a powerful, shared interest in his destruction. Their political goals and Stephen's personal vendetta merged into a single, monstrous purpose. The plan for the trial was hatched overnight. It would have been carefully, almost conspiratorially, planned in the private chambers of the later Anne. Picture the scene: Stephen VI, his face illuminated by flickering lamplight, pacing back and forth on the mosaic floor. With him are Agelt Rude and a handful of lawyers, or less unallied cardinals and legal experts. They aren't just plotting a coup, they are choreographing a piece of grotesque political theater. Their main legal weapon, the one they sharpened over and over, was the violation of canon law. This is the official justification they would present to the world. The key statute they focused on was Canon 15 from the Second Council of Nicaea, which forbade a bishop from leaving his assigned see to take over another, calling it spiritual adultery. Formosus had been Bishop of Porto, and then became Bishop of Rome. To Stephen and his allies, this was an open and shut case. It was the legal hook on which they could hang their entire prosecution. They would argue that because he had illegally taken the papacy, he was never truly the pope. He was an impostor, a usurper. And if he wasn't the pope, then none of his actions were valid. A simple, devastating legal argument. But they also needed to address the inconvenient fact that Pope Marinus I had already pardoned Formosus for all this years ago. How do you get around the previous pope's decree? Easy. You just declare that Pope Marinus I was wrong. You argue that he had no authority to pardon such a grave sin against canon law. In the chaotic legal landscape of the 9th century, you could always find a precedent or a forgotten rule to justify whatever you wanted to do. It was less about consistent legal principle and more about who could shout the loudest and had the sharpest knives. Here's a little-known detail that adds another layer of strangeness: the role of the Roman mob. Stephen and Agelt Rude knew they couldn't just hold a secret trial. It had to be a public spectacle to have the desired effect. They needed to sway public opinion. So in the weeks leading up to the synod, you can imagine their agents spreading rumors through the markets and taverns of Rome. Stories about Formosus's greed, his ambition, his betrayal of Rome by siding with the Germans. They would have painted him as a monster, a perjurer who defiled the chair of St. Peter. They were preparing the audience, turning the city's population into a chorus for their grim play. Historians still puzzle over the exact timeline of Stephen's ascent. He was elected pope around May of 896. The trial, the cadaver synod, didn't happen until January of 897. What was he doing for those 8 or 9 months? The answer is likely threefold: consolidating power, purging his enemies, and meticulously planning the trial. He had to ensure every cardinal, every bishop, every key administrator in Rome was either a loyal ally or too terrified to oppose him, making sure that when the curtain finally rose, there would be no one in the audience brave enough to boo. The seed of revenge, planted so long ago, had now grown into a gnarled, twisted tree, ready to bear its horrifying fruit. The plan is set. The legal justifications, however flimsy, have been polished. The political allies are in place. Now, the idea, born in the dark recesses of paranoia and ambition, needs to be spoken aloud. It needs to become an order. Imagine Pope Stephen VI calling a meeting. Not the grand public synod that is to come, but a smaller, more intimate gathering in a private apostolic apartment within the Lateran Palace. The room is probably opulent but claustrophobic, heavy tapestries on the walls swallowing the sound. Present are his most trusted advisors, a few hardline Spo-Latin cardinals, a stern-faced canon lawyer, and perhaps even a Gelti Root herself, a silent, powerful presence in the corner. The air is thick with anticipation. They have all discussed the Formosus problem for months. They have all agreed that his legacy must be destroyed. But now Stephen is about to articulate the how. He paces, perhaps his papal robe swishing on the cold marble floor. He stops and turns to face them, and then he says it. He doesn't just want to declare Formosus as papacy invalid in a decree. He doesn't just want to condemn his memory. He wants to put the man himself on trial, the corpse. You have to imagine the momentary stunned silence in that room. Even for these hardened political operators, men accustomed to the brutality of 9th century Rome, the idea is shocking. It's one thing to slander a dead rival, to seize his followers' property, or to burn his decrees, but to dig up his rotting body, dress it in papal vestments, and place it on a throne for a formal legal proceeding, it's a leap into a dimension of vindictiveness so profound it borders on insanity. This is the moment where political vengeance scared unless into something else. It becomes pathological. One of the cardinals might have shifted uncomfortably. A lawyer might have cleared his throat, ready to point out the irregularity of the proceedings. The defendant, after all, would be somewhat unresponsive. But Stephen Villa would have been ready for this. He would have laid out his reasoning, a chilling blend of cold logic and fanatical zeal. He cannot escape God's judgment, so why should he escape ours, he might have argued. His crimes were committed in the flesh, so his flesh must be present to answer for them. He would have framed it not as an act of revenge, but as an act of purification. A necessary, if unpleasant, surgery to remove a cancerous tumor from the body of the church. He would have stressed the theatricality of it all. The people must see, he'd insist. The clergy who followed him must see. A written condemnation could be ignored, forgotten. But the image of a dead pope on trial, a rotting corpse being stripped of its holy robes, that is a message that no one would ever forget. It was a form of psychological warfare. He wasn't just trying to win a legal argument, he was trying to create a traumatic memory, a scar on the collective consciousness of Rome. Here's a small, bizarre detail that gives us a window into the medieval mindset. The concept of the ordeal was still a very real part of the legal system. To determine guilt or innocence, a defendant might be forced to carry a hot iron or be plunged into water. The belief was that God would intervene and protect the innocent by preventing them from being burned, or by making them sink innocent instead of float guilty. While this trial wasn't an ordeal in the classic sense, it shared a certain magical, ritualistic thinking. By bringing the physical body into the courtroom, Stephen was invoking a kind of grim, supernatural legalism. He was treating the corpse as if it still contained some essential part of the person, a vessel that could be held accountable. Historians continue to debate Stephen Vi's mental state. Was he a cold, calculating politician using a shocking tactic to secure his power, or was he genuinely unhinged? The term for this, which some scholars have used, is synodal madness. It's the idea that he was so consumed by his hatred and the echo chamber of his fanatical supporters that he lost all sense of proportion and rationality. He may have truly believed that he was acting as God's instrument, that this grotesque spectacle was his sacred duty. The objectors in that room, if there were any, would have quickly fallen silent. To argue against the Pope's plan would be to mark oneself as a Formosan sympathizer. In the paranoid climate of Stephen's court, that was a political death sentence. And so the murmurs of doubt would have subsided, replaced by nods of agreement. The plan was not just accepted, it was embraced. The legal team would start drafting the official charges. The logistics would be assigned. The decision is made. The Rubicon of reason has been crossed. The most bizarre trial in the history of the papacy, and perhaps in the history of the world, is now inevitable. A dead man is about to have his day in court. The decision, made in the suffocating privacy of the papal apartments, now ripples outwards. A formal decree is drawn up. A papal bull, stamped with the leaden seal of Stephen VI, is dispatched from the Later and Palace. The order is simple, direct, and utterly unprecedented. The body of Pope Formosus, deceased 9 months now, is to be exhumed from its tomb in street Peter's basilica and brought forth for judgment. Imagine being the cleric who receives this order. You are perhaps a senior official at the basilica, a man who oversees the daily rites and the sanctity of the tombs. You spend your days surrounded by the scent of old stone, melting beeswax, and incense. Your world is one of solemn ritual and deep reverence for the dead, especially for the former vicars of Christ who are laid to rest within these sacred walls. Then a papal messenger arrives, his horse sweating, and hands you a rolled parchment. You break the seal. As you read the Latin script, your blood runs cold. You read it again, certain your eyes or your Latin are failing you. But there it is in black and white. An order from the reigning Holy Father to commit what feels like an act of profound sacrilege, to desecrate a papal tomb. This is the moment the plan moves from a dark fantasy to a shocking reality. The news would have spread through the clerical corridors of the Vatican like a virus. At first it's a whispered rumor, too insane to be believed. Have you heard the Pope wants to dig up Formosus? That's just gossip, a smear from the Espoltans. No, I saw the order. The reaction within the church would have been one of stunned horror, at least among those not in Stephen's inner circle. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a violation of one of the most fundamental tenets of Christian society, respect for the dead. The bodies of the faithful, and especially of popes, were considered holy relics, sleeping in consecrated ground as they awaited the final resurrection. To disturb them was an act of profound impiety. This brings us to a key point of canon law that Stephen V. I was gleefully trampling. Church law itself prescribed severe penalties, including excommunication, for anyone who violated a tomb. By ordering the exhumation, Stephen was, in a twisted irony, committing a crime for which he could have been cast out of the church himself. He was placing his own authority as Pope above the very laws. He was a stunning display of autocratic power. But who could stop him? He was the Pope. In the theological framework of the time, the Pope held the power of the keys, given to street. Peter by Christ himself the power to bind and to loose, to make and unmake laws. While this power was supposed to be used for the salvation of souls, a Pope like Stephen V. I could interpret it as the power to do whatever he wanted. Dissent was not an option. Any bishop or cardinal who spoke out would be immediately accused of treason and heresy, of being a secret Formosan loyalist. They were caught in a trap. To obey was to participate in a sacrilege, to disobey was to face ruin. Most chose to obey. And so a group of workmen is assembled. You can imagine their reluctance. These are not ghouls or grave robbers. They are ordinary Roman laborers, stonemasons and diggers, probably deeply pious in their own way. They are now being ordered on pain of papal displeasure to take their crabbles and shovels into the most sacred place in Christendom and break open a tomb. Here's a little known detail about St. Peter's at this time. It wasn't the grand Renaissance basilica you see today. It was the original 4th century Constantination basilica. A vast, sprawling, and somewhat gloomy building filled with tombs, mosaics, and the accumulated relics of half a millennium. The papal tombs were likely located in a special portico or chapel near the main altar, a place of supreme honor. The work would have been done with a grim, fearful solemnity. The heavy marble slab covering Formosus' sarcophagus would be pried loose, the sound echoing unnaturally in the cavernous, silent church. The workmen would be sweating, and not just from the physical effort. They would be making the sign of the cross constantly, whispering prayers under their breath, asking for forgiveness for the deed they were being forced to do. Historians still debate the level of resistance. Were there clerics who actively tried to prevent it? The official records, of course, were written by Stephen's people and they show a smooth, unopposed process. But it's almost certain that there was immense passive resistance, quiet non-compliance, feigned sickness, clerics suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. The papal court was likely split between a terrified majority who went along with it and a small, fanatical minority who drove the process forward with righteous fury. The exhumation order was a brutal loyalty test for the entire Roman clergy, and the first act in a drama that was about to get much, much stranger. The tomb is open. The stage is set. The heavy marble lid of the sarcophagus groans as it's finally pushed aside. A puff of stale, musty air escapes the tomb. carrying the scent of damp stone, decaying linen, and the faint, sweetish odor of corruption. The workmen recoil, crossing themselves again. Even the supervising priests, loyal to Stephen VI, likely take an involuntary step back. There, lying in the gloom of his stone coffin, is what remains of Pope Formosus. Let's be clinically precise about what they are seeing. This is not a skeleton. It has been 9 months since his death in the spring of 896. He was likely embalmed, as was customary for a man of his stature, but 9th century embalming techniques were a far cry from modern methods. They mostly involved washing the body with oils and spices and wrapping it tightly in linen. Its slow decomposition, it didn't stop it. So you are looking at a body in a state of advanced decay. The skin, where it's visible, would be discolored, waxy, and shrunken against the bones. The handsome features that gave Formosus his name are long gone, replaced by a sunken, desiccated death mask. His eye sockets are hollow voids. His lips have receded, pulling back from his teeth in a fixed, ghastly grin. The papal vestments, he was buried in, are stained and mouldering, clinging to the shriveled form beneath. The overwhelming impression is one of profound, pathetic decay. This is not a holy relic. It is a 9-month-old corpse. The air in the basilica is thick with a horrified silence, broken only by the shuffling feet of the workers. The order is given to lift the body out. This is a delicate and gruesome task. The corpse is fragile. The limbs are stiff with rigor mortis that has long since passed, leaving the joints loose and unpredictable. As the workmen carefully maneuver the corpse out of the sarcophagus, a piece of cloth might tear, revealing more of the decay beneath. The smell intensifies. It's a moment of pure, visceral horror. This is the main point of the scene, the physical reality of the act. It's easy to talk about a cadaversa in it as an abstract, bizarre historical event. But in this moment, for these men, it is a nauseantly real and tangible experience. They are handling the decomposing body of a man who, less than a year ago, they revered as the head of their faith. Here's a small, morbid detail about decomposition that they would have been contending with. A body after 9 months, even if embalmed, can sometimes enter a state called deposire or grave wax. It's a waxy, soap-like substance that forms on the body in moist, anaerobic conditions. The corpse of Formosus may not have been just dry and brittle, but also coated in this strange, greasy material, making it even more unpleasant to handle. The body is lifted clear. It's probably laid on a simple wooden biwa or canvas stretcher. And now, for the first time in 9 months, the corpse of Pope Formosus is upright in a sense. It's carried out of the hallowed confines of St. Peter's Basilica out into the January air. The news of the exhumation has surely spread through the city by now. A small, morbidly curious crowd may have gathered at a respectful distance, held back by papal guards. They watch in stunned silence as the pathetic bundle is carried out of the church. What are they thinking? The historical record, written by elites, rarely tells us what the common person felt. But you can imagine a mix of fear. This is wrong. This is an offense against God and nature. This will bring a curse upon the city. The sky above Rome suddenly seems a little darker, the wind a little colder. The procession begins. It's a short journey from St. Peter's across the river to the Later and Palace, where the trial is to be held. It is the most macabre parade in Rome's long history. Not a triumphal procession with cheering crowds and laurel wreaths, but a slow, grim march with a corpse as its centerpiece. Historians still argue about the exact state of the body. Some later, more sensational accounts describe it in lurid detail, likely exaggerating for dramatic effect. But the core truth remains. The men in that procession were not carrying a symbol. They were carrying a rotting human body, and the man who had ordered this, Pope Stephen VI, was waiting for it. He was waiting for his star witness, his silent defendant, to arrive. The body of his hated rival, now little more than a grotesque puppet, was being delivered to him. The stage was set, the audience was terrified, and the guest of honor had just been pulled from his grave. The decomposing body of Formosus arrives at the Lateran Palace. It's not taken to the morgue or some back room. It's brought to a chamber where the next stage of this meticulously planned desecration is to unfold. The order has been given, the corpse must be prepared for court. Imagine the scene. You are in a cold, stone-walled room. The air is heavy with the smell of decay, hastily masked by clouds of burning incense. The corpse of Formosus lies on a table. Standing around it are a few nervous papal servants and junior clerics, their faces pale. They have been given a task that surely no one in the history of the papacy has ever been asked to perform. They must dress an untold corpse in the full, magnificent vestments of a reigning pope. This is, for me, the most surreal and psychologically disturbing part of the entire affair. It's a moment of pure, nightmarish absurdity. They are not just putting a corpse on trial, they are creating a grotesque effigy, a parody of papal authority. The process would have been a horrifying ordeal. The body is stiff in some places, alarmingly fragile in others. The servants have to handle it, maneuvering the shrunken, desiccated limbs. First, they would have to put on the alb, the long white linen tunic, then the stole, the narrow band of embroidered silk worn around the neck. Then the chasuble, the ornate, heavy outer vestment, shimmering with gold thread and perhaps studded with semi-precious stones. These are sacred garments, blessed and consecrated. Now they are being draped over decaying flesh. As they work, a piece of dried skin might flake off and fall to the floor. A finger bone, loose in its shriveled casing, might snap with a dry little crack. The servants would flinch, their stomachs turning. They are trying to impose an image of supreme power and holiness onto an object of supreme biological decay. The cognitive dissonance would have been overwhelming. And then comes the final touch, the papal tiara, the three-tiered crown of the papacy, a symbol of the Pope's triple authority as priest, prophet, and king. A servant, hands trembling, would have to place this heavy, jewel-encrusted crown upon the corpse's head. The head is little more than a skull with some parchment-like skin stretched over it. The crown would not sit right. It would be too large, too heavy. It would loll to one side, a final, absurd indignity. Why do this? Why not just have the body there in its burial shroud? This is the key point. The dressing of the corpse was a crucial piece of political theatre. Stephen VI didn't want to try a mere body, he wanted to try Pope Formosus. He needed the visual representation of the office. By clothing the corpse in the symbols of papal power, he was making a terrifying statement. This is what I think of the papacy of my predecessor. It is a hollow sham, a dead thing dressed in finery. It was a calculated act of symbolic humiliation. Here's a small, weird detail that highlights the legalistic madness of it all. For the trial to be valid in Stephen's twisted view, the defendant had to appear as he was when he committed his alleged crimes. His crime was being an illegal pope, so he had to appear dressed as the pope. It's a level of pedantic, procedural insanity that is hard to comprehend. It's like demanding a defendant in a modern fraud case wear the exact suit he wore when he signed the dodgy contract. Historians are still debating the emotional and psychological impact this would have had on the participants. Did they become numb to it? Did they see it as a holy act, as Stephen insisted it was, or were they deeply traumatized? Later chronicles, written after Stephen's fall, described the attendees of the synod as being paralyzed with fear. This preparation of the body was the first intimate taste of the horror to come. It was a warning. This is what our new pope is capable of. This is the depth of his obsession. Once stressed, the corpse is no longer just a corpse. It is a horrifying spectacle. A puppet king waiting for the show to begin. The servants would have to prop it up. They couldn't just leave it lying on a table. So they secure it to a chair, perhaps using ropes or straps hidden beneath the opulent vestments to keep it from slumping over. The final image is one of pure Gothic horror. A 9-month-old cadaver, shrunken and discolored, is sitting upright. It is dressed in the most splendid robes of Christendom. A golden jeweled crown rests precariously on its head. Its desiccated, skeletal hands are ranged in its lap. It is ready. The defendant has been prepped. Now it's time to take him to the courtroom. The great bronze doors of the Basilica of St. John later unswing open. This is not St. Peter's. This is the Pope's Cathedral, his official seat as Bishop of Rome. It is, in a sense, his home turf. And today, It has been transformed into a theater of the macabre. Let's walk inside. The air is cool and damp, carrying the familiar scent of incense, but today it's thick, cloying, failing to mask the faint, foul undertone that followed the guest of honor into the hall. The vast nave of the basilica is filled with people, hundreds of them. These are the most important men in the Roman Church: cardinals in their scarlet robes, bishops in purple, abbots of powerful monasteries, and a whole host of lesser clergy, scribes, and legal officials. Their faces are a mixture of fear, grim fascination, and sullen obedience. Many of them owe their careers to the man whose body is about to be put on trial. They are here to witness the ritual humiliation of their patron, and by extension, themselves. The basilica is arranged like a courtroom. At the far end, in the apse where the main altar usually stands, a throne has been set up. It's a grand, gilded chair, the papal throne itself, and on it sits Pope Stephen VI. He is in his full pontifical vestments, the tiara on his head, looking every bit the supreme authority. His face is a mask of cold, righteous fury. He is the judge, the prosecutor, and the chief witness, all rolled into one. Arranged in rows facing him are the attendees, the jury in this show trial. They sit in grim silence, avoiding eye contact with each other. To their left and right, armed guards from the Duke of Spoleto's personal militias stand impassively. Their presence is a stout reminder this is not a theological debate. This is an exercise of raw power. And then, all eyes turn to the defendant's chair. Another throne, slightly less grand, has been placed in the center of the hall. It is currently empty. This is where the star of the show will sit. A side door opens. A slow, shuffling procession enters the basilica. A group of papal servants, their faces ashen, are carrying a chair, and seated in that chair, propped up and tied in place, is the body of Formosus. A collective gasp, a rustle of hundreds of robes, ripples through the assembly. They had all heard the rumors. They all knew this was coming. But the reality of it is a physical shock. The sight of that crowned and vested corpse, its head lolling slightly to one side, its hollow eye socket staring blankly out at the men who once served it, is an image of pure, nightmarish horror. The corpse is carefully placed in the defendant's chair, directly opposite Pope Stephen VI. The two popes, one living and consumed by hate, the other dead and decaying, now face each other across the nave of the great basilica. The stage is set. This scene is the historical centerpiece of the event. The Cadaver Synodos age Orrenda has officially begun. The sheer visual audacity of it is what has made it infamous for over 1,000 years. It's a moment that perfectly encapsulates the dark century of the papacy. It is a collision of absolute power, religious fanaticism, political vengeance, and a bizarre, legalistic madness. Here's a small detail that often gets lost: the weather. The synod took place in January. Roman winters can be damp, grey, and chilling. Imagine the weak winter light filtering through the high windows of the basilica, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, ghoulish shadow. There's no grand, heavenly sunlight blessing this proceeding. The atmosphere is oppressive, gloomy, and cold. Historians are still divided on the precise layout of the room and the exact number of attendees. The primary accounts we have were written later, by authors hostile to Stephen VI, so they may have dramatized certain elements. For example, the writer UTP Arend of Cremona, our main source, wrote about it decades later and was known for his lively, often gossipy style. The condemnation. What was going through Stephen's mind as he looked at the rotting body of his enemy? Did he feel a sense of triumph, of disgust? Was there a flicker of madness in his eyes? We can only imagine him feeling a surge of righteous power. He has done it. He has literally raised his enemy from the grave to face his judgment. In his mind, he is not a monster. He is an instrument of divine justice, purifying the Holy See. The assembled bishops and cardinals are trapped. They are silent witnesses to a sacrilege, their complicity sealed by their presence. They are the unwilling audience and the coerced jury in the strangest trial Rome has ever seen. The silence in the basilica deepens. Pope Stephen VI raises a hand. It is time for the proceedings to begin. The basilica is deathly quiet. Pope Stephen VI from his throne gazes with an unnerving intensity at the defendant. The corpse of Formosus, it's propped in its chair, a silent, grotesque mockery of a living man. Its crowned head is tilted at a slight angle as if in perpetual confusion. Its jaw, no longer supported by muscle, hangs slightly agape, giving it an expression of slack-jawed surprise. It is the perfect defendant it cannot refute. It cannot refute. It cannot show emotion. Stephen VI raises his voice, the sound echoing in the vast, cold space. The trial begins. He doesn't start with a calm reading of the charges. He starts with a roar of accusation, his voice filled with the venom that has been brewing for years. He addresses the corpse directly, screaming questions at it. Why did you, in your ambition, usurp the universal realm and see you, who were already bishop of the See of Porto? The question hangs in the air, vibrating with fury. And then silence, a deep, profound, and utterly predictable silence from the accused. The corpse, of course, does not answer. Its hollow eye sockets stare blankly forward. The whole assembly holds its breath. The absurdity of the situation is laid bare in that single moment. A living man is screaming at a dead one. This is the central, insane mechanism of the trial. Stephen VI will pose a question, full of rage and accusation, and the corpse will answer with its profound, unsettling silence. For Stephen and his faction, this silence is not an absence of a response, it is an admission of guilt. How can the defendant argue when the charges are so obviously true? His silence is his confession. The scene is so bizarre that it's almost comical, but for the men in that room it was pure terror. They are watching the head of their church, the man who holds the keys to heaven, unravel in a display of what can only be described as controlled madness. He is performing a ritual of pure hatred, and they are his captive audience. Now here is where the proceedings take a turn into the truly pathetic. The corpse could not be entirely without a voice. That would make the trial a monologue, not a legal proceeding, however twisted. A defense had to be offered, if only for show. So a solution was found. A young, terrified deacon was appointed to be the corpse's lawyer. Imagine this poor soul. He's a junior cleric, probably in his late teens or early 20s. He's been plucked from obscurity and given the most terrifying job in Christendom. His task is to stand or crouch behind the rotting, vested corpse of Formosus and speak on its behalf. This is a historical detail that feels like it's straight out of a horror movie. Every time Pope Stephen VI screams a question at the corpse, this trembling deacon is supposed to provide a defense. When Stephen asks why he broke his oath never to enter Rome, the deacon, his voice cracking, would have to whisper a pre-scripted, feeble response from behind the throne. He acted out of a desire to serve the church, or the oath was sworn under duress and was therefore invalid. The deacon's performance would have been utterly unconvincing, and that was the point. He was set up to fail. His arguments were weak, his delivery terrified. His presence served only to make the whole spectacle seem like a legitimate trial, while ensuring the outcome was never in doubt. He was a legal prop, just as the corpse was a physical one. Historians are still not entirely certain who this deacon was, or what happened to him afterwards. Did he volunteer for this role to curry favor with the new pope? Highly unlikely. Was he chosen because he was known to have Formosan sympathies? And this was his punishment? This is a more plausible, and much crueler, theory. Forcing a man to defend his dead patron in a show trial, knowing his defense would be futile, is a particular kind of psychological torture. The image is seared into the historical memory of the church Pope Stephen, bellowing his accusations. The silent, decaying corpse on its throne. And behind it, the pale, sweating face of a young man, forced to channel the voice of the dead. It is at a blow of absolute power and absolute terror. The silence of the corpse is the most powerful element in the room. It speaks volumes. It's a silence that absorbs all the hatred, all the rage, all the insane legal arguments, and offers nothing in return. It is the silence of the grave, a quiet tribute to the sound and fury of the living. For the attendees, watching this unfold, that silence must have been the loudest sound in the basilica. It was the sound of reason dying, of sanctity being desecrated, and of a papacy plunging headfirst into a moral abyss. Let's zoom in on this unfortunate young deacon, the man given the worst speaking role in history. We don't know his name. He is a footnote in the chronicles, an anonymous stand-in for a dead man. But for a moment, let's try to inhabit his reality. He's probably been awake all night, sweating in his simple cot, repeating the feeble legal arguments he's been given. He was likely chosen for his youth and lack of political connections, making him utterly expendable. He is terrified of Pope Stephen VI, who looks at him with eyes that see not a young cleric, but the ghost of his hated enemy. He is also quite literally standing in the shadow of death. The physical reality of his task is a sensory nightmare. He is crouched or standing directly behind the throne where the corpse of Formosus is propped up. He is so close he can probably smell the decay, that sickly sweet odor that the incense can't quite conquer. He might even be able to see the mouldering threads on the back of the chasuble, or a wisp of remaining hair on the back of the corpse's skull. The psychological pressure is immense. He has to speak for a dead body. Pope Stephen VI leans forward, his face contorted in a sneer. Did you not swear an oath upon the Holy Gospels that you would never again enter the city of Rome or seek ecclesiastical office? He thunders, his voice booming through the basilica. He points an accusing finger at the silent figure in the chair. All eyes turn to the defendant. A few seconds of charged silence pass. Then, from behind the throne, a thin, reedy voice emerges. It's the deacon. He has to project, but he's trembling. Merciful Father, he might begin, his voice cracking. The oath was extracted under duress from our Holy Father, Pope John, and was therefore invalid in the eyes of God. His words are met with scorn. Stephen VI might laugh. A harsh, ugly sound. Duress, the only duress was your own ambition. You perjured yourself. You spat on a vow made to God. This is the rhythm of the trial. A furious, bellowed accusation from Stephen, followed by a terrified, whispered defense from the deacon, which is then immediately shouted down. The deacon is not there to mount a genuine legal defense. He is a theatrical device. His role is to provide the illusion of a dialogue, to give Stephen's monologue the semblance of a trial. This is a key point about the perversion of justice happening here. A real trial requires, at minimum, the possibility of acquittal. There must be a genuine examination of evidence. Here, the evidence is irrelevant and the verdict is preordained. The deacon's presence is a testament to Stephen's legalistic madness. He needed the form of a trial to be correct, even as he completely gutted its substance. What was the deacon's defense strategy? Such as it was, he would have relied on a few key arguments, all of them true, but all of them useless in this court. First, the duress argument for the oath. This was his strongest point. Formosus did swear the oath under threat of excommunication and political ruin. Any reasonable court would have seen that. Second, the papal pardon argument. He would have pointed out that Pope Marinus I, a legitimate successor to Street, Peter, had formally absolved Formosus of his oath and restored him to his position. This should have been the end of the matter. A pope's decree is a pope's decree. Third, the precedent argument. He might have tried to argue that other bishops in history had moved from one see to another, and that the rule was not always strictly enforced, especially when it came to the unique position of Bishop of Rome. But every argument he makes is swept aside. When he brings up the pardon by Pope Marinus, Stephen VI likely retorts that Marinus himself acted illegally, that one pope cannot pardon a sin against the fundamental laws of the Church. It's a classic case of might makes right, dressed up in legal jargon. Here's a small, weird detail that some chronicles mention. The deacon wasn't just speaking for the corpse, he was forced to adopt a cringing, fearful posture, as if he himself were the one on trial. He had to embody the guilt of Formosus. He was not a lawyer, he was an actor playing the part of a guilty man. Historians are still divided on whether the deacon was a single person, or if the role was shared. It's possible that for each charge, a different cleric was forced to come forward and offer a defense, spreading the honor of this terrible task around. But the most common account, from UTPR and of Cremona, presents it as one single, terrified young man. His ordeal is a microcosm of the entire Synod. He represents all the powerless clergy in that room, forced to participate in a charade they know is wrong. His trembling voice is their collective, unspoken fear. He is a symbol of reason and law being trampled by raw, obsessive power. As he stands there sweating in the shadow of a corpse, he is the loneliest man in Rome, a footnote in a story of madness, tasked with the impossible job of giving a voice to the dead. The trial drags on, a relentless barrage of accusations. Let's break down the specific charges that Pope Stephen I hurls at the silent corpse and its trembling mouthpiece. They are a fascinating, if terrifying, cocktail of legalism, political slander, and pure invention. The main charge, the one Stephen returns to again and again, is the violation of Canon 15. You were Bishop of Porto. He would scream, "A bishop is married to his see." You committed spiritual adultery by abandoning your flock to seize the throne of Rome. This was their cornerstone argument. It sounded official, legal, and deeply pious. It framed Formos's ambition not as a political drive, but as a fundamental sin against the sacred order of the Church. It was a charge designed to resonate with the deeply conservative, rule-bound minds of the assembled clergy. The second major charge was perjury. You swore an oath, on the body of street. Peter himself, you swore never to return to this city. This was the most personal and damning accusation in a deeply religious age. An oath was a sacred contract with God. To break it was to risk eternal damnation. By focusing on the perjury, Stephen wasn't just accusing Formos of a crime, he was declaring him a man without honor, a man whose soul was already forfeit. The fact that the oath was sworn under duress and later pardoned was a mere inconvenience, swept aside by the sheer force of Stephen's rage. Then the charges take a more political turn. Stephen accuses Formos of conspiring with the barbarians, the Germanic emperors. You crowned Arnulf, a foreigner, in this holy city. You invited his armies into Italy, bringing fire and sword upon our people. This was a charge aimed squarely at the Roman nationalist sentiments of his SP, Olet and backers and the Roman mob. He was painting Formos as a traitor, a puppet of foreign powers who had betrayed his own people. This had nothing to do with Canon and everything to do with the brutal geopolitics of the time. He was retroactively justifying the SP, Iletan factions rise to power by framing their opponents as enemies of the state. And here's where the charges get truly strange and almost laughably petty. This is a lesser-known but fascinating detail of the trial. Formos was accused of performing episcopal acts while he was in a state of lay status. This sounds complicated, but it's simple. After Pope John II had excommunicated him, Formos was, for a time technically, no longer a priest or a bishop. He was a layman. Stephen I and his prosecutors went back through the records and accused Formos of things like celebrating Mass or ordaining priests during this period. There is absolutely no evidence that this ever happened. It was a completely fabricated charge, designed to paint Formos as someone who flagrantly unrepeatedly disregarded church authority his entire life. Another bizarre accusation was that Formos had dressed as a bishop and conspired to become pope even while he was in exile. They were essentially accusing him of thinking about being pope, of harboring ambition in his heart, which they treated as a crime in itself. This is a classic show trial tactic. When you can't prove a person's actions were criminal, you attack their supposed intentions and thoughts. Historians are still trying to untangle the web of these accusations. It's a field of study where the deeper you dig, the murkier it gets, because all the primary sources are intensely biased. The records of the Cadaver Synod itself were ordered to be destroyed by a later pope, so we are reliant on accounts written after the fact by people with their own politically legal proceeding according to the twisted logic of the time, while others see it as a complete juridical monstrosity with no legal basis whatsoever. This debate highlights how flexible and weaponized the law could be in this era. The charges, screamed one after another at the silent corpse, created a powerful cumulative effect. It was an avalanche of accusation that the feeble, whispered defenses of the deacon could never hope to withstand. To the terrified assembly, it sounded like an open and shut case. Ambition, perjury, treason, sacrilege. Stephen was not just convicting a man, he was assassinating a character, systematically dismantling a reputation, until nothing was left but the image of a monster. And through it all, that does not flinch, it does not protest. It just absorbs the hatred. It silences its only defense, and in its own way, It is a powerful one. It is a powerful one. It highlights the one-sidences of the whole affair. Stephen VI is not wrestling with an opponent, he is shadowcoring Sib with his own demons, projecting them onto the blank canvas of a dead body. The charges say far more about the accuser than they do about the accused. They are a portrait of a mind consumed by a decade of festering hatred, now unleashed in a torrent of legalistic fury. The barrage of accusations finally subsides. Pope Stephen VI, his voice rawned hoarse from hours of shouting, leans back on his throne. A heavy, exhausted silence falls over the basilica. The show is over. The deacon, his ordeal finally complete, has likely retreated into the shadows, his face buried in his hands. All eyes are now on Stephen. The time has come for the verdict. There is no deliberation. There is no hodling of the jury. The assembled cardinals and bishops are not asked for their opinion. They are there to witness and consent, not to judge. Their silence is their assent. This is a court of one. Stephen VI slowly rises to his feet. He lets the silence hang in the air for a dramatic moment, savoring his victory. He looks from the terrified faces of the clergy to the pathetic, crowned figure of his dead enemy. His face is a mask of grim, triumphant certainty. He raises his right hand, not in a blessing, but in a gesture of condemnation. His voice, now lower but no less intense, rings out through the cold, cavernous space. Having heard the testimony, he declares, as if there had been any real testimony, and having considered the grave and manifold crimes committed by this man, we, in our authority as the Vicar of Christ, do hereby find the accused Formosus, formerly Bishop of Porto and usurper of the Papal See, to be guilty. The word hangs in the air, guilty. We declare that his election to the See of Rome was illegal and therefore null and void. He was never the true pope. This is the first hammer blow. With this sentence, Stephen achieves his primary political goal. The entire 4-day half-year reign of Formosus is officially erased. It never happened. He continues, spelling out the consequences. Therefore, all acts, all decrees, and all ordinations performed by him during his illicit pontificate are hereby declared invalid. A quiet, horrified gasp ripples through the assembly. This is the second, more devastating hammer blow. Every man in that room who had been made a priest or a bishop by Formosus is in that instant stripped of his office. They are no longer clergy. They are laymen. Their careers, their authority, their very identities have just been obliterated. They are forced to sit there and watch as the Pope who gave them their power is condemned, and in doing so, they become unmade. It is a moment of profound personal and institutional chaos. This ruling on the invalidity of ordinations is a major historical point and one of the most lasting consequences of the Synod. It threw the Roman Church into an administrative nightmare. For years afterwards, the Church would be wrestling with the Formosan question: who was a legitimate priest and who wasn't. It created factions and feuds that would last for decades. But Stephen isn't finished. The verdict needs a punishment. A judgment on a memory and a legacy is not enough. There must be a physical, tangible consequence for the body that sits before him. As punishment for his crimes, Stephen announces, his voice dropping to a chilling, cruel tone, "This vessel of corruption shall be stripped of the holy vestments it has defiled." At his signal, two papal servants approach the corpse's throne. They move with a visible, terrified reluctance. The entire assembly watches in morbid fascination. The first servant, his hands trembling, reaches out and lifts the heavy, jeweled tiara from the corpse's head. The crown, the very symbol of the papacy, is removed. Then, they begin to strip the body. They pull off the heavy, embroidered chasuble. They unwind the silk stole. They pull the white alb over the corpse's head, an awkward and gruesome process. The sacred garments, one by one, are removed, leaving the shrunken, decaying body clad only in a simple linen burial shroud. It's a reverse coronation, a ritual of degradation. The effigy of Pope Formosus is being dismantled, reduced back to a mere corpse. Here's a small, gruesome detail that Liu of Cremona's chronicle insists upon. As they are handling the body, the stench of decay, now unobstructed by the heavy vestments, fills the air around the throne. The servants recoil, their faces green with nausea. The punishment is not just symbolic, it is a visceral, physical act of defilement. The verdict is in. Guilty. The sentence has been passed. Annulment and degradation. The political goals have been achieved. The personal vengeance has been satisfied. Any rational man would stop here. The point has been made in the most horrifying way imaginable. But Pope Stephen VI is not a rational man. He is a man consumed by a pathological hatred. And for him, the punishment has only just begun. There is one more act of mutilation to come. The corpse of Formosus, now stripped of its papal finery, sits naked except for its burial shroud. It looks small, pathetic, a shriveled husk of a man. The grandeur and horror of the vested effigy are gone, replaced by a stark, pitiful reality. But Stephen VI isn't looking at the body with pity. He's looking at it with a cold, surgical fury. The public degradation is complete. Now comes the personal, symbolic mutilation. He gives another signal. One of the papal guards, a burly soldier from the SBO-led militia, steps forward. He is holding a short, sharp knife. He approaches the corpse. A hush falls over the basilica. The clergy watch, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. They have no idea what's coming next, but they know it will be terrible. The soldier grabs the corpse's right hand. The desiccated, claw-like hand is stiff and brittle. He isolates the first 3 fingers, the index finger, the middle finger, and the ring finger. These are not just any fingers. In the Latin rite of the Catholic Church, these are the fingers of blessing. When a pope or a bishop gives his apostolic blessing, he raises his right hand and extends these 3 fingers, symbolizing the Holy Trinity. Every priest Formosus had ever ordained, every sacrament he had ever consecrated, every blessing he had ever given to the faithful was channeled through these 3 fingers. They were the physical instrument of his holy power. And Stephen VI is about to erase that power in the most literal way imaginable. The soldier places the blade at the base of the 3 fingers. There's a moment of grim concentration. Then, with a series of sharp, deliberate movements, he cuts them off. The sound is probably not what you'd expect. Not a wet, fleshy sound, but a dry, snapping crack. The sound of old parchment tearing, of dry twigs breaking. The desiccated tendons and brittle bones give way. The 3 fingers, symbols of a lifetime of priestly authority, fall to the stone floor with a faint, dry clatter. A collective, shuddering gasp runs through the room. This is an act of unimaginable cruelty and sacrilege. It's one thing to strip a body of its clothes. It is another thing entirely to mutilate it. This act crosses a line into a kind of primal, vindictive rage that leaves everyone in the room shaken to their core. This is the most infamous and visceral act of the entire synod. The severing of the blessing fingers is a potent and horrifying symbol. Stephen is not just saying Formosus wasn't a pope. He is attempting to retroactively unbless every single holy act Formosus ever performed. He is trying to reach back in time and nullify the grace that flowed through those hands. It's a theological statement made with a knife. The 3 severed fingers lie on the floor. A servant is ordered to pick them up. He does so with a look of profound disgust, probably using a cloth so he doesn't have to touch them. What happens to them immediately after is not recorded. They are evidence, a trophy of this grim victory. Here's a small, debated detail. Some accounts suggest it wasn't a soldier but a cleric, or even Stephen himself, who ordered the fingers be cut. The image of the Pope himself directing this mutilation is almost too monstrous to contemplate. But given the depth of his hatred, it's not entirely out of the question. The most reliable sources, however, point to a guard or servant carrying out the physical act at the Pope's command. The reaction of the assembled clergy would have been one of pure, unadulterated terror. They have just witnessed their supreme pontiff afforded the ritual mutilation of his predecessor's corpse. The message is crystal clear. This is what happens to enemies of the SBO-led faction. This is what happens to those who defy Pope Stephen VI. There are no rules of decency or tradition that he will not break to destroy his opponents. The act also had a profound psychological effect. It transformed the synod from a twisted legal proceeding into a scene of brutal, physical violence. The abstract arguments about canon law were now punctuated by the concrete reality of a dismembered hand. Historians are still staggered by this moment. It reveals the heart of the Dark Century more than any other event. The papacy, the institution meant to be the moral center of Christendom, was being led by a man who would use a butcher's knife to settle a political score. It shows a complete breakdown of the sacred. The body, which should have been revered as a vessel awaiting resurrection, was treated as a piece of meat. The mutilated corpse, now missing its fingers, still sits on the throne. It seems even more pathetic now. The act of mutilation has not made it look more guilty, only more victimized. Stephen V. I may have felt a surge of triumphant power, but in the eyes of many in that room, he had just revealed himself to be a monster. The verdict had been delivered, the body stripped, the fingers severed. But the final indignity was yet to come. The corpse was not to be granted the peace of a grave. The trial is over. The verdict is guilty. The sentence has been carried out with gruesome, vindictive precision. But for Stephen V.I., the show is not quite finished. The mutilated corpse of Formosus cannot be allowed to rest. It cannot be returned to a tomb, not even an unmarked one. Its defilement must be total and public. The final act of this grotesque drama will take place on the streets of Rome and in the murky waters of its river. The order is given to remove the body from the basilica. The servants, who by now must be numb with horror, lift the dishonored corpse from its throne. It's no longer a defendant or an effigy, it's just a piece of human garbage to be disposed of. They carry it out of the later Anne, not through the grand main doors, but likely through a side exit, like trash being taken out the back. Outside, the weak January sun is probably beginning to set, casting long, cold shadows across the city. The papal guards clear a path. A cart is waiting. The body of the man who was once the most powerful figure in Christendom is unceremoniously dumped onto the rough wooden planks of the cart. And now begins the final humiliating journey. The cart, carrying its grim cargo, begins to rattle through the streets of Rome. This isn't a solemn funeral procession. It's a parade of shame. It's likely that a crier walks ahead, proclaiming the verdict, announcing to the citizens of Rome that this is the body of a perjurer, a usurper, a false pope. Imagine being a Roman citizen coming out of your workshop or your home, drawn by the commotion. You see the naked, mutilated body. You might have been one of the people who cheered for Formosus when he was pope. You might have received a blessing from the very hand that is now a mangled stump. The sight would be profoundly shocking and deeply unsettling. It's a display of raw, terrifying power. The message from the new rulers is clear: this is what we do to our enemies. Do not cross us. The reaction of the crowd is a point of historical debate. The chronicles written by the elite don't give us a clear picture of the common person's response. Were they horrified? Were they cowed into silent fear? Or had the SPO Latin propaganda been so effective that some of them actually joined in, jeering and throwing refuse at the corpse? It was almost certainly the dominant emotion. The cart rumbles on, its path taking it towards the river Tiber. The Tiber has always been Rome's lifeblood, but it has also served as its sewer and its dumping ground. For centuries, the bodies of executed criminals and political enemies were unceremoniously tossed into its muddy currents. To be thrown into the Tiber was to be denied a proper burial, a final act of damnation that denied the body a place in consecrated ground. This is the ultimate historical point, the denial of burial. In Christian, and indeed pre-Christian Roman tradition, proper burial was a sacred duty. It was essential for the peace of the soul and for the hope of resurrection. To leave a body imbued was an act of supreme cruelty, believed to doom the spirit to wander restlessly. By ordering Formosus to be thrown into the river, Stephen V.I. was attempting to condemn him not just in this life, but in the next. The cart reaches the banks of the Tiber. The river is probably swollen and brown from the winter rains. The guards pull the body from the cart. There's no ceremony, no final prayer. They simply swing it, once, twice, and hurl it into the water. The corpse hits the surface with a dull splash. For a moment, it floats, a pale, bobbing shape in the murky water. Then, the current catches it, and it begins to drift slowly downstream, turning over and over, until it is swallowed by the gloom and disappears from sight. The guards and servants turn and walk away, The small crowd disperses, heading back to their homes in fearful silence. The show is finally, truly over. Pope Stephen VI has had his ultimate revenge. He has exhumed his enemy, tried him, convicted him, stripped him, mutilated him, and denied him a grave. He has done everything in his power to erase Formosus from existence. As he sits in his palace, Stephen must have felt a sense of finality, of absolute victory. He has purged the church. He has purged the church. He has silenced his enemy forever. But in the strange, superstitious world of 9th century Rome, the dead do not always stay quiet, and a river does not always keep its secrets. The corpse of Formosus is gone, swallowed by the Tiber's murky currents. For Pope Stephen VI and his SPO-Latin allies, this is the end of the story. The enemy has been physically and symbolically obliterated. They can now get on with the business of ruling. They start issuing new decrees, appointing their own loyalists to the positions left vacant by the purged Formosan clergy. The city of Rome, terrified into submission, falls quiet. But then something unexpected happens. A story begins to spread, starting as a whisper among the fishermen and common folk who live and work along the riverbanks, and slowly growing into a citywide rumor. A few days after the body was thrown into the river, a monk by the name of Gregory was fishing in the Tiber, some miles downstream from the city. He wasn't fishing for sport, he was fishing for his supper, a common practice for the poor and for members of monastic communities. As he's pulling in his net, he feels an unusual weight. It's heavy, snagged on something large. With great effort, he hauls it towards the bank. And there, tangled in the coarse mesh of his fishing net, is the naked, mutilated body of Pope Formosus. You have to imagine the monk's shock and terror. He has just netted the most infamous corpse in Christendom. The body is in an even worse state now, pale and bloated from its time in the water, the wounds on its hand gaping. But it is unmistakably the former pope. This is the kind of event that, in a deeply superstitious age, is never just a coincidence. It is immediately seen as a sign, a miracle, or, more accurately, a portent. God himself has intervened. The river, an instrument of pagan-style defilement, has refused to consume the body. It has returned the corpse to the world of the living, a divine rebuke to the sacrilege committed by Stephen VI. This is a major turning point in the story. The narrative begins to shift. Up until now, Stephen VI has controlled the story. He staged the trial, he announced the verdict, he performed the public desecration. But this event is outside of his control. This is a story that bubbles up from below, from the common people. And it has a power that no papal decree can match. The monk Gregory doesn't just quietly rebury the body. He understands the significance of what he's found. He secretly takes the corpse and hides it, perhaps in his monastery's chapel or a hidden crypt. He knows that this body is now a holy relic of a different kind of relic of papal injustice. The news spreads like wildfire through Rome. The river gave him back. People whisper in the markets. It's a sign from God. The story almost certainly gets embellished as it travels. People start saying the body was surrounded by a heavenly light. They say the fish in the river swam alongside it in a procession. They say that when the body was pulled from the water, it began to perform miracles. A blind woman regained her sight. A lame man was able to walk. Here's a fascinating and slightly strange detail about medieval miracle stories. They were a form of public relations and political protest. In an age where most people were illiterate in politics, spreading a miracle story was a way to express an opinion. To say that Formosus's body was performing miracles was a direct and powerful way of saying the cadaver synod was wrong, Formosus was a holy man, and Pope Stephen VI is a tyrant and a sinner. It was a grassroots PR campaign for the dead. The official sources from the time, written by clerics, are a bit more reserved. They don't all mention the flashy miracles, but they all agree on the core event: the body was recovered from the Tiber. This fact alone was damning enough. Historians today still debate the miracles. Were they genuine, psychosomatic events, where people's profound faith caused real physical effects, or were they just propaganda? Stories invented by the pro-Formosan faction to rally support? The answer is almost certainly the latter. But that doesn't make them any less powerful as a historical force. Pope Stephen VI and his faction would have heard these rumors with growing alarm. They had tried to dispose of a body, and in doing so, they had accidentally created a martyr. Their act of ultimate desecration had backfired spectacularly, transforming their victim into a folk saint. The more they tried to clamp down on the stories, the faster they would spread. The corpse of Formosus, hidden away in a secret location, becomes a symbol of resistance. It's a rallying point for the now underground Formosan faction. They have lost their official power, but they are winning the battle for public opinion. The mood in the city is beginning to change from fear to a quiet, simmering anger. The people of Rome are starting to believe that God is on Formosus's side. And if God is on his side, then who is Pope Stephen VI, an impostor? The stage is being set for a backlash. The story of the body's miraculous recovery from the Tiber is now the talk of Rome. What was once a political victory for Pope Stephen VI is rapidly becoming a public relations disaster. The city is buzzing with a dangerous energy. The fear he had so carefully cultivated is being replaced by something far more volatile: righteous indignation. The Roman people are starting to see the Cadaver Synod not as a legal proceeding, but as a monstrous sin that has brought divine displeasure upon their city. And then nature itself seems to weigh in. In the summer of 897, several months after the Synod, a powerful earthquake shakes Rome. Imagine you're there. The ground beneath your feet suddenly begins to heave and tremble. Buildings, already ancient and unstable, groan and sway. Stones and roof tiles clatter down into the narrow streets. People scream and run for open ground, their faces filled with terror. The quake itself might not have been catastrophic in terms of casualties, but its psychological impact was immense. And in the chaos, one building suffers significant and highly symbolic damage: the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the very place where the ghoulish trial was held. The roof of the Grand Basilica collapses, sending a cascade of heavy timbers and tons of masonry crashing down into the nave. The throne where Stephen VI sat in judgment, the spot where Formosus's corpse was displayed, it's all buried under a mountain of rubble. For the people of 9th century Rome, this is not a coincidence. This is not a random geological event. This is the hand of God, striking down the scene of the crime. The message could not be clearer or more terrifying. God is angry. He has passed his own judgment on the Cadaver Synod, and his verdict is one of wrath. This is the main historical event that seals Stephen's fate. The recovery of the body from the river was a rumor, a story that could be dismissed by skeptics. The earthquake was a physical, undeniable fact. Everyone saw the ruin of the Pope's own cathedral. It was divine confirmation of the miracle stories. The narrative is now completely out of Stephen's control. He is no longer seen as a strong leader purifying the church, but as a cursed figure, a Jonah whose sins are bringing disaster upon the entire city. The political enemies of Stephen VI, remnants of the Formosan faction, and other rival Roman families who were just looking for an excuse, seize on this opportunity. They begin to fan the flames of public anger. This is what happens when you defile the dead. They'd say in the forums and public squares, this is what happens when a monster sits on the throne of St. Peter. He has brought a curse upon us all. Here's a small, interesting detail about Roman society at the time. The city was, in many ways, still semi-pagan in its thinking. While officially Christian, the people held onto a deep-seated belief in omens, portents, and curses. An earthquake was a classic bad omen, a sign that the pax dear and the peace of the gods had been broken. While they would have framed it in a Christian context, God's wrath, the underlying superstitious dread, was a powerful, ancient force. Stephen hadn't just angered the Christian God, he had violated a taboo that resonated with the deepest, most primal fears of the Roman people. The atmosphere in the city becomes electric with coup plotting. The factions that had been crushed by the Espoltans begin to regroup and conspire. They now have the one thing they were missing: the support of the Roman mob. The same populace that Stephen's allies had once whipped up to support their cause is now turning against them with a vengeance. Historians are still somewhat divided on the exact sequence of events. The chronicles are compressed and often contradictory. Was the popular uprising a spontaneous explosion of public fury, Or was it a carefully orchestrated coup by rival elites who simply used the earthquake as a pretext, as is so often the case? The truth is likely a combination of both. The popular anger was genuine and widespread. The political elites simply channeled it for their own purposes. Pope Stephen I is now a prisoner in his own palace. The Sboletan guards who once protected him are now barely able to hold back the angry crowds that gather outside the Later Anne, demanding justice. He can hear the shouts from his chambers. He is isolated and increasingly paranoid. His allies within the clergy, the same men who sat in silent complicity during the synod, are now quietly distancing themselves from him, trying to save their own skins. His great triumph has crumbled into dust, quite literally. The man who tried to control history is about to be consumed by it. The backlash is no longer a matter of if, but when, and it will be swift and merciless. The Roman summer of 897 is hot, tense, and thick with the promise of violence. Pope Stephen VI is trapped. The earthquake has shattered his authority, and the miracle stories about Formosus have sanctified his victim. His political allies are melting away, and the Sboletan Duke, his primary protector, is either unable or unwilling to send enough troops to quell the citywide unrest. Stephen is a king with no kingdom, a pope with no flock, hiding in the ruins of his own cathedral's palace complex. The end comes swiftly. The historical accounts are brief and to the point, as they often are when describing a coup. There is no record of a prolonged siege or a pitched battle. The uprising is decisive. A mob, likely led and organized by the rival Roman aristocracy, who backed the Formosan faction, storms the Later Anne palace. Imagine the scene. A wave of angry citizens, armed with whatever they can find, knives, farming tools, clubs, surges through the gates. They are fueled by a potent cocktail of superstitious terror and political fury. They believe they are not just overthrowing a tyrant, but cleansing the city of a divine curse. The few remaining papal guards are either overwhelmed or, more likely, they simply step aside and let the mob pass. Loyalty has its limits, especially when your boss is clearly on the losing side of a fight with God. The mob rampages through the corridors of the palace, shouting for Stephen. They find him. There is no dramatic last stand. He is simply seized, a man who, just months before, held absolute power, now a helpless captive in the hands of the people he ruled. He is stripped of his papal vestments. This is a deliberate, symbolic echo of what he himself did to the corpse of Formosus. The man who ordered the stripping of a dead pope is now himself being publicly humiliated, his symbols of authority torn from him. The reversal of fortune is complete and brutally symmetrical. He is then dragged through the streets and thrown into a dungeon. Probably the Mamertine prison, an ancient, infamous dungeon near the Roman from where enemies of the state had been held since the days of the Roman Republic. It was a dark, foul, subterranean hole, a place people were sent to be forgotten or to await execution. Now here is where Stephen's fate becomes a subject of some historical debate. What exactly happened to him in that prison? The most common and accepted account is that his enemies, not content to let him languish, decided to finish the job. They didn't want him to become a rallying point for the Sboletan faction. They didn't want a long, drawn-out trial that could further destabilize the city. They wanted a quick, clean, and quiet solution. Sometime in July or August of 897, a few weeks after his imprisonment, assassins slip into his cell. They don't use a knife or poison, methods that could be messy or traceable. They use a cord. He is unceremoniously strangled to death, garroted in the dark of his prison cell. It's a grimly ironic end. The man who desecrated a cult to avoid the messiness of a purely political purge is himself disposed of in a quiet, brutal, and efficient manner. His reign, which began with such a loud and horrifying bang, ends with a silent, ignominious whimper. A small, interesting detail is the motive of his killers. Were they purely acting on political calculation, removing a rival, or was there an element of personal revenge? It's highly likely that among the conspirators who ordered his death were cardinals and clergy who had been ordained by Formosus and whom Stephen hadn't made. For them, killing Stephen would have been both a political necessity and a deeply personal act of vengeance. The official story put out by the new regime would have been simple. Pope Stephen VI has died in prison. The cause of death would be left deliberately vague. Everyone knew what had happened, but the thin veneer of deniability was maintained. His death marks the definitive end of the Cadaver Synod affair, at least in its first, most violent chapter. The chief architect of the horror is dead. The city of Rome breathes a collective sigh of relief. The curse, they hope, has been lifted. The fall of Stephen VI is a classic tale of hubris. He was a man so consumed by hatred that he flew too close to the sun. His attempt to control history and memory through an act of ultimate power backfired completely. Instead of erasing Formosus, he immortalized him. Instead of securing his own legacy, he doomed himself to be remembered for all time as the corpse pope, a monster and a madman. His brutal, lonely death in a dark prison cell was the final, fitting postscript to a reign of terror that began with a desecrated grave, where Stephen VI strangled in his dungeon. The immediate crisis is over. The city has had its revenge. But the chaos he unleashed is far from settled. The most pressing issue is the one he created: what to do about the legacy of Formosus and who is now in charge. The anti-Stephen faction, a coalition of Formosan loyalists and other Roman nobles, moves quickly to install a new pope. They choose a man named Romanus. His reign is short, only about 4 months, but he takes the first crucial step. One of his very first acts as pope is to formally annul the entire Cadaver Synod. He declares the trial of Formosus to have been a sacrilegious farce. Its verdict and sentence is utterly void. This is a huge moment. For all the clergy who had been unmade by Stephen's decree, their holy orders are instantly restored. They are priests and bishops again. The administrative nightmare is in theory over. Pope Romanus essentially hits the reset button, taking the church back to the moment before Stephen's madness began. But simply issuing a decree isn't enough. The honor of Formosus needs to be publicly unceremonial restored. The body, which had been secretly guarded by the monk Gregory and his allies, is now brought out of hiding. This time, it is not paraded through the streets in shame, but treated with the reverence due to a martyred pope. A grand procession is organized. Imagine the scene, a complete reversal of the one we saw just a few months prior. The clergy of Rome, now firmly back in the pro-Formosan camp, march in their finest vestments. The people of the city, who had watched in horror as the body was desecrated, now line the streets, this time in solemn reverence. The corpse of Formosus, now hailed as a victim of tyranny, is carried on a magnificent bier. It is brought back to St. Peter's Basilica, the very place from which it had been so violently exhumed. There, a full papal funeral mass is held. The liturgy is chanted, incense fills the air, and prayers are offered for the soul of the Pope who had been so horribly wronged. It is an act of profound collective atonement. Then the body is redressed in new papal vestments. This act is deeply symbolic. They array clothing the body in the dignity that Stephen VI had ripped away. It's a visual declaration that he was, and always had been, a legitimate pope. Finally, the corpse is laid to rest once more, not in its original tomb, which had been desecrated, but in a new sarcophagus, placed in a position of honor among the tombs of other popes. The heavy marble lid is sealed. This time they pray. It will be for good. This is the main historical point: the formal rehabilitation of Formosus. It wasn't just a quiet administrative correction. It was a major public spectacle designed to undo the psychological and spiritual damage of the Cadaver Synod. They were trying to heal the city's trauma through ritual. But here's a small, fascinating detail that shows how deep the paranoia ran. Even in death, Formosus was a controversial figure. The sources are a bit hazy on this, but some historians suggest that the body was buried between the tombs of 2 other popes, almost as if to guard it and to prevent anyone from ever attempting such a desecration again. The memory of the Cadaver Synod had so scarred the institution that they took physical precautions to protect the dead from the living. The papacy of Romanus ends abruptly. He was likely deposed and sent to a monastery, the political winds shifting once again. And he is succeeded by Theodore I. Theodore's reign is even shorter, a mere 20 days. But in those 20 days, he doubles down on the pro-Formosan policy. He convenes his own synod, which formally reaffirms the legitimacy of Formosus and all his acts. He makes a special point of reconferring the validity of the clergy ordained by Formosus, putting their particular ghost to rest once and for all, or so he thought. It seems like the story should end here. The villain is dead, the hero is vindicated and reburied, and his legacy is restored. It's a neat, tidy conclusion. But Roman politics in the 9th century is never neat and tidy. The pendulum of power, having swung violently against Stephen VI, is about to swing again. The ghost of the Cadaver Synod, it turns out, is not so easily exorcised. The deep-seated factionalism that started the whole mess has not gone away. It's just been dormant, waiting for its next opportunity. The peace brought by Romanus and Theodore II is just a temporary truce in a long and bitter war. Pope Theodore II's 20-day reign is a fleeting moment of clarity and justice. He not only confirms the rehabilitation of Formosus, but also takes a crucial further step. He orders that the official acts, the minutes of the Cadaver Synod, be collected and publicly burned. Imagine a scene in the courtyard of the Lateran Palace. A bonfire is lit. A high-ranking cleric, acting on the Pope's orders, steps forward holding a stack of parchments. These are the official records of Stephen VI's monstrous trial. They contain the list of charges, the testimony, the final verdict of guilty, and the gruesome sentence. The cleric consigns them to the flames. The crowd watches as the parchments curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The ink that recorded the sacrilege vanishes in a puff of smoke. This is an act of historical sanitation. Pope Theodore II is trying to wipe the event from the official memory of the Church. He is attempting to treat the Cadaver Synod as a cancerous tumor that, having been cut out, must now be incinerated so that not a single cell remains. By destroying the documents, he is declaring that the event was not just wrong, but so profoundly illegitimate that it does not even deserve a place in the archives. It was a phantom synod, a historical nightmare that Rome now wishes to forget. This act of burning the records is a key historical point. It's the reason why our knowledge of the synod is so fragmented and reliant on later, often biased, narrative accounts. The primary sources, the court records themselves, went up in smoke. We are left with historians like Lew T.P.R. and of Cremona, who wrote decades later with a flair for drama and a strong anti-Stephen agenda, or O.I. Elias of Naples, who was more concerned with the legal and theological fallout regarding the validity of ordinations. We have to piece the story together from these secondary echoes because the original voice of the event was deliberately silenced. But Theodore's reign is too short to cement this new consensus. After his death, the papacy is seized by a man named John Ix. John is another pro-Formosan pope, and he understands that more is needed than just a bonfire. The entire affair needs to be systematically and legally dismantled in a way that can't be easily reversed. So, in 898, he convenes not one, but two major synods, one in Rome and one in Ravenna, to deal with the fallout once and for all. These synods, which we might call the anti-Cadaver synods, are meticulous and thorough. First, they solemnly reaffirm the invalidity of Stephen VI's trial. Second, they formally forbid the practice of trying people after they are dead. This is a crucial legal innovation, a direct response to the Synodus H. Orrenda. John Ix is trying to close the legal loophole that Stephen VI exploited to ensure such a travesty can never happen again. Here's a small, slightly bureaucratic but important detail of John Ix's synod. They rule that in any future papal election, the consecration of the new pope must take place in the presence of imperial envoys. This was a direct attempt to stop the local Roman factions, like the Espartans, from hijacking the papacy through mob violence. By requiring the emperor's representatives to be present, John Ix was trying to reintroduce a powerful, external check on the local gang warfare that had caused the crisis. He was in essence siding with Formosus's old political strategy. And what of the men who participated in the Cadaver Synod? John Ix's synod condemns them. The bishops and cardinals who sat in silent complicity are forced to repent. Those who actively took part are excommunicated. The synod also formally burns the newly reissued acts of the Cadaver Synod because apparently some copies had survived or been rewritten. They are trying to be as thorough as possible. It feels like the final nail has been hammered into the coffin of this sordid affair. There is a new law against posthumous trials. The villainous Pope's memory is condemned. The hero Pope's memory is celebrated. The institutional guardrails have been put back in place. The Church seems to have learned its lesson. But the very thoroughness of John Ix's actions reveals a deep-seated anxiety. The need to hold multiple synods to repeatedly burn the same documents, and to create a new law shows just how profoundly the Cadaver Synod had shaken the institution. It was a trauma that they couldn't just move on from. They kept picking at the scab, trying to make sure the wound was truly clean. Historians are still debating the effectiveness of John Ix's reforms. Was this a genuine turning point for the papacy? A moment of sincere reform, or was it just another swing of the political pendulum? The victorious Formosan faction solidifying their power and punishing their defeated rivals? The answer is probably both. John Ix seems to have been a genuinely reform-minded pope, but he was also a product of the factional system. His reforms were both a principled stand against the horrors of the past and a savvy political move to entrench his own party's dominance. The problem was, in 9th century Rome, dominance was always temporary. The snake of factionalism had been wounded, but it was not dead. For a few short years, it seems like order has been restored. John Ix's careful legal work, the repeated condemnations of the Cordova Synod, and the formal rehabilitation of Formosus appear to have settled the matter. The Formosan faction is in charge, and the memory of Stephen VI is one of shame and infamy. The story, it seems, has reached its moral conclusion. But this is 10th century Rome, and the story is never over. The political landscape remains a treacherous swamp of shifting alliances and brutal family rivalries. The peace established by John Ix was fragile, and it shatters with his death around the year 900. The next few years see a rapid succession of popes, with the papacy falling back into a chaotic tug-of-war between various Roman aristocratic factions. And then, in the year 904, a man seizes the papal throne who will wrench the entire narrative into a shocking reversal. His name is Sergius II. To understand Sergius II, you have to understand his past. He wasn't a newcomer to papal politics. In fact, he was a key player in the original Cadaver Synod. He had been a bishop and a prominent member of Stephen VI's anti-Formosan party. He was one of the enthusiastic participants in the Grudish trial. After Stephen's fall, Sergius was excommunicated and forced into exile for his role in the affair. For years, he has been in the political wilderness, nursing his own grudge, waiting for his chance to return. And in 904, backed by the powerful Roman nobleman Theophylacti, Count of Tusculum, Sergius III marches back into Rome, deposes the sitting pope, and has himself installed. His past association with the Cadaver Synod isn't a liability, it's his platform. He returns to power with a specific agenda to vindicate his old ally, Stephen VI, and to once again destroy the legacy of Formosus. In one of the most stunning reversals in papal history, Pope Sergius II convenes his own synod. And in it, he completely overturns the judgments of Popes Theodore II and John Ix. He declares that the Cadaver Synod was, in fact, a just and legal proceeding. He proclaims that Pope Stephen VI was right, and he declares, once again, that Formosus was a false pope, a perjurer, and a usurper, and that his body should be exhumed. This is the moment the story tips from tragedy into sheer repetitive farce. According to the ever-dramatic chronicler UTP Arndt of Cremona, Sergius II actually had Formosus's body dug up for a second time. After more than a decade in the grave, the now skeletal remains were supposedly subjected to another trial, another condemnation, and another beheading, which seems anatomically unlikely for a skeleton, but UTP Arndt loved a gruesome detail. Finally, the much-abused bones were, once again, thrown into the Tiber. Now, historians are deeply divided on this point. Is UTP Arndt's account of a second Cadaver Synod had ascended literary true? Many modern scholars are skeptical. UTP Arndt was writing with a strong anti-Sergiate for dramatic effect. It seems more likely that Sergius II's reversal was a legal one. He issued a formal decree that reinstated the verdict of the Cadaver Synod. He didn't need to physically dig up the body again. The political and legal damage was done with the stroke of a pen. The story of the second exhumation may be a piece of brilliant, effective propaganda by Sergius's enemies. designed to paint him as being just as monstrous as Stephen VI. Whether physical or purely legal, the impact of Sergius II's actions was devastating. He didn't just rehabilitate Stephen VI, he had a laudatory epitaph carved for his tomb, praising him as a great pope. He unleashed a new wave of purges against the pro-Formosan clergy. And, most damaging lie, he once again declared all of Formosus's ordinations to be null and void. The chaos that John IX had so carefully tried to contain was unleashed all over again. The question of who is a real priest once again plagued the Italian church. This period, often called the pornocracy or rule of the harlots due to the influence of Sergius's powerful patrons, the Theophile Acts including the famous Maras IA, marks the absolute nadir of the papacy's dark century. Sergius II's reign represents the ultimate triumph of factionalism over principle. His actions show that the Cadaver Synod wasn't really about canon law or the sanctity of oaths. It was, and always had been, about raw political power. The guilt or innocence of Formosus was not a fixed truth, it was a political football, changing with each new pope and each new ruling faction. For nearly 15 years, the official status of a dead man was the single most important political issue in Rome, a litmus test for every power player in the city. The story of the Cadaver Synod doesn't have a clean ending because the conflict it represented never truly ended. It just evolved. Let's pull back from the macabre cycle of exhumatations and reversals and look at the long, messy aftermath. The ghost of Formosus, stirred up by Sergius II, didn't just haunt the papal palace, it created a ripple effect of chaos that spread throughout the entire church in Italy, primarily through one crippling but complex issue: the validity of ordinations. This wasn't just an abstract theological problem. It was a crisis that affected the spiritual and legal lives of thousands of people. Imagine you are a simple villager in 10th century Italy. The priest in your local parish was ordained by a bishop, who in turn was consecrated by Pope Formosus. For years, this priest has been the center of your spiritual life. He baptized you, he hears your confession, he gives you communion, he presides over marriages and funerals. You believe the sacraments he performs are the literal channel of God's grace. Now, a decree arrives from Rome, from Pope Sergius III, declaring that Formosus was never a legitimate pope. Therefore, the bishop he consecrated was never a legitimate bishop. And therefore, your priest was never a legitimate priest. The implications are terrifying. Was your baptism valid? Is your marriage legitimate in the eyes of God? When you confess your sins, is there anyone with the authority to actually absolve you? The very foundation of your salvation, as you understand it, has just been declared a sham. This is the real-world consequence of the Cadaver Synod. It created a profound spiritual anxiety and a complete legal mess. This is the core historical problem known as the Formosan question. For nearly 2 decades, the church in Italy was thrown into a state of what we might call clerical chaos. Bishops and priests who had been ordained in the Formosanly declared laymen. Their churches and lands were seized by rivals from the anti-Formosan faction. They were forced to be reordained, a practice that was itself theologically problematic, as ordination was considered a sacrament that imparted an indelible mark on the soul and could not be repeated. This led to endless legal battles and even armed conflict between rival claimants for bishoprics and monasteries. One cleric would have a letter of appointment from a Formosan pope, while another would have one from an anti-Formosan pope. Who was the rightful leader? It depended entirely on who was currently in power in Rome. The situation wasn't tenable. Here is a small, specific example that shows the chaos in action. A prominent writer and cleric from Naples named Oilias wrote extensively in defense of the Formosan ordinations. He dedicated much of his career to crafting complex legal and theological arguments to prove their validity. His writings give us a powerful insight into the intellectual gymnastics required to navigate this crisis. He argued that the grace of a sacrament like ordination comes from God, not from the moral or legal status of the person performing it. This idea, known as ex opere operato from the word performed, was a crucial argument, but it was far from universally accepted at the time. The fact that a man like Oilias had to spend years writing defenses for something that should have been straightforward shows how deep the crisis was. The Formosan question became a political weapon. If you were a duke and you wanted to seize the lands of a wealthy monastery, you could simply discover that its abbot traced his ordination back to Formosus. You could then have him deposed and install your own candidate, seizing the monastery's assets in the process. The cadaver synod provided a religious pretext for what was often simple, naked greed and political ambition. Historians are still untangling the long-term effects of this. The constant infighting and legal uncertainty severely weakened the authority of the papacy. It made it clear to everyone in Europe that the Holy See was not an impartial spiritual arbiter, but a prize to be fought over by vicious Roman gangs. This damage to the papacy's reputation would take centuries to repair. The whole affair was finally, and somewhat quietly, put to bed later in the 10th century. The Church eventually settled on the theological principle that Elias had argued for the validity of a sacrament does not depend on the worthiness of the minister. This ruling effectively grandfathered in all the disputed ordinations and allowed the Church to move on. They didn't officially vindicate Formosus again, they just changed the underlying rule to make the whole question irrelevant. It was a practical solution to an insane problem, but the memory lingered. The story of the cadaver synod became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the papacy's darkest hour. It served as a stark reminder of what can happen when legalism isn't tethered from reason, when personal hatred is given absolute power, and when the Church becomes just another battlefield for political ambition. The body of Formosus was eventually left in peace, but the questions raised by his ghoulish trial would echo through the halls of canon law for generations. So after all the exhumatations, the trials, the condemnations, the rehabilitations, and the reversals, what are we left with? We're left with a story so profoundly strange that it feels like a dark fairy tale. But it's a true story, and it serves as a perfect, horrifying snapshot of a period the history books call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. This era, stretching roughly from the death of Pope Formosus in 896 to the middle 11th century, represents the absolute lowest point of the papacy. The cadaver synod wasn't an isolated moment of madness, it was the prologue and the defining event of a century of chaos. The papacy, for about 150 years, ceased to be a major spiritual or political force in Europe. It became a purely local affair, a toy passed around by the feuding aristocratic families of Rome, most notably the powerful Theophilus Dti and Crescentii families. The popes of this era were a grim succession of the obscure, the incompetent, and the corrupt. Many were the sons or lovers of the powerful women who truly ran the city, like Theodora and her infamous daughter Maraziae. Maraziae, in particular, was the ultimate power broker. She was the mistress of Pope Sergius, the one who reinstated the cadaver synod verdict, and their son later became Pope John XI. She had another Pope, John X, imprisoned and likely murdered, and a deeply dysfunctional one at that. The cadaver synod in this context is more than just a bizarre anecdote. It's the event that set the tone for the entire century. It established a precedent of factional violence and demonstrated that there was no line that couldn't be crossed. If a pope could dig up and try his predecessor's corpse, then anything was possible. Imprisonment, murder, simony, the buying and selling of church offices, it all became depressingly common. Here's a key historical takeaway: the weakness of the papacy during the Saeculum Obscurum had a profound effect on the rest of Europe. With no strong, central moral authority in Rome, power became much more localized. Local bishops and powerful abbots became more independent. Kings and emperors felt free to interfere in church affairs in their own lands. In a way, the chaos in Rome contributed to the fragmentation of power that characterized the height of the feudal age. Centralized Christendom with the Pope at its head completely fell apart. And what of the main characters in our story? Their legacies are forever intertwined with this one grotesque event. Formosus is remembered not for his diplomatic skill or his missionary work in Bulgaria, but as the Pope who was put on trial after he was dead. He is a victim, a symbol of how even the highest office could offer no protection from the hatred of one's enemies. His body, dragged from its tomb, paraded through the streets, mutilated, and thrown in the river, became a metaphor for the desecration of the papal office itself. Stephen V.I. is frozen in history as a monster, a madman. He is the corpse pope, a caricature of tyrannical rage, Whatever his motivations, be they legalistic zeal, political calculation, or pure pathological hatred, he is remembered only for this one unforgivable act of sacrilege. His name is a permanent stain on the history of the papacy. And this brings us to one final, lingering question that historians still debate. Why did it happen? We've explored the political rivalries, the legal arguments, the personal hatreds. But, at its heart, the Cadaver Synod remains a profound psychological puzzle. It speaks to a darkness, a capacity for bizarre and ritualistic cruelty, that is hard for us to fully comprehend from our modern vantage point. A uniquely medieval form of madness, or does it reveal a timeless truth about the terrifying places that absolute power, fused with obsessive hatred, can take the human mind? The story doesn't offer easy answers. It just leaves us with that haunting, indelible image: a dead man in papal robes, sitting on a throne in a cold basilica, silently facing his screaming accuser. It's a stark reminder that the past is not just a foreign country, it can be a deeply, deeply weird one. And sometimes the stories it tells are more unsettling than any fiction. And so our journey into the strange darkness of 9th century Rome comes to a close. The echoes of the trial fade away, leaving only the quiet hum of the night around you. Feel the tension leaving your shoulders, the story receding like the tide pulling away from the shore. The figures of Stephen and Formosus, once so vivid, now blur and soften, becoming ghosts once more, confined to the dusty pages of history. Imagine yourself drifting now, away from the cold stone of the later Anne, away from the murky waters of the Tiber. You're floating in that peaceful space between wakefulness and sleep. The frantic energy of the story gives way to a gentle, quiet stillness. Your breathing is slow and deep, a soft rhythm in the silence of your room. Each breath pulls you a little further into comfort, a little deeper into rest. Think of the river Tiber, not as a place of desecration, but as a long, slow-moving ribbon of silver under the moonlight. It flows on, carrying away the old hatreds, washing the memories clean, moving ever onward toward the great, quiet sea. Let your own thoughts drift away like that, carried on a gentle current, moving towards the peaceful ocean of dreams. There are no more trials, no more accusations. There is only the calm, the quiet, and the deep, restorative peace of the night. You are comfortable, then you are ready to sleep. The end of the article. Good night.